I've often quoted as saying I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
They share our beliefs, our convictions, our hopes, and our dreams. These are the conservatives of the heart. They are our people.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and James. James, so tell me, what are you reading these days?
Yeah, Johnny. So I've been rereading The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America, actually, by George Nash, which is an ISI book, and it's been great to dig back into the sort of origins of the intellectual tradition which we're working in now.
That's fantastic, and it's such a great book, especially working at ISI, being able to see the role that ISI has played throughout the past 67 years. Shaping the conservative movement. One question I have for you, James, that I noticed when I read that book is sort of the early period in the conservative movement, shortly after ISI was founded and Russell Kirk published The Conservative Mind, and National Review was founded in 1955. You really saw, for the first decade of National Review, sort of leading up to Barry Goldwater's candidacy, sort of really sort of robust debate. There wasn't necessarily a clear sense in terms of what conservatism was, where it's going. There was just a lot of hashing things out. And then it seemed like the focus coalesced a bit when they had the political opportunity to sort of rally behind certain core policy positions with Barry Goldwater. Didn't end up being successful, but then it sort of paved the ground for Ronald Reagan to come along in the 80s and sort of win on that agenda. Sure. What period do you see conservatism in right now? Are we in that sort of fighting and hashing it out period, or do you think there's really a kind of an agenda that we're coalescing around?
That's a great question. I think we're in the kind of hashing it out, figuring it out period again. One thing that's struck me as interesting is this sort of the interest in planning that's come about both on the left and somewhat on the right is kind of similar in a lot of ways to the groundwork that led to what Nash calls the revolt of the libertarians. And I actually I'll be interested to see if we see another revolt of the libertarians here in the next coming years. But yeah, I definitely think we're in a period of figuring out, what it means to be conservative again, evidenced by so many essays and questions and issues like the TAC Journal being written about that exact question, what is conservatism? And so it will be interesting to see where we land and what lines are drawn. Yeah,
and just to go a little deeper, what specifically was the revolt of the libertarians? Can you remind me and our audience?
So that's kind of it's in reaction to kind of former New Deal policies and also, one very specific revolt is Hayek's revolt, right? When people are kind of calling fascism, like they're saying that Nazi fascism is kind of the epitome of capitalism and that capitalists and fascists are both wrong. And Hayek's like, are you kidding me? What are you talking about? So he writes a memo to I can't remember who at London School of Economics, but eventually, his book, Road to Serfdom, amongst others, the foundation of the Mont Pelerin Society, all these groups sort of come together and they found journals like the Freeman, and Frank Jodorov, founds ISI, and it's so to answer your question, that's what the revolt of the libertarians is.
Fascinating. All right. Well, thanks for that history lesson. With that in mind, let's move on to our student member question. This one comes from Nathaniel Cameron. Nathaniel says, quote, "Conservatives used to be focused more on a balanced federal budget and reducing federal spending, but I'm not sure that's been the case in recent years, especially throughout COVID. What role do you see fiscal conservatism playing within the future of conservatism in America? Will conservatives lead the way towards long-term financial stability?"
Wow, that's a tough question for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, we're in this sort of period of hashing out what it means to be a conservative, and I think that right now this is one of the fundamental questions: where do we stand on economics? are we sort of committed to the free market way of thinking, or was that merely a solution to the problems of the Cold War era? And so I think it's going to be interesting to see where the conservative movement lands. I'm not sure whether or not it will be lead the way in long-term financial stability, as Nathaniel asked.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Obviously, I think any healthy country, just like any healthy household, you can't run endless debts and deficits forever, or eventually it's going to come due. The United States being the world's sort of largest, and most powerful country, and the global reserve currency has a little bit more forgiveness, especially given the size of our economy, to run more debt than other countries. Now, I mean, generally speaking, I don't think having some debt is probably okay. Having an excessive amount is going to be a problem in the long term. So I think, in some sense, conservatives should always be for fiscal responsibility. But I think in cases like, the COVID-19 pandemic, you have to sort of weigh competing concerns. And, I don't have a particular problem with coming to the conclusion that there needs to be, if the government is deciding in many places to force businesses to shut down, if that's a government decision, it would make sense that the government would provide some degree of compensation. Obviously, you don't want that compensation to create other forms of dependency on government in the long run. But I think there are particular situations where prudence is the guiding virtue behind conservative economic policy.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point.
Great. So today we just finished an amazing interview with Tim Carney from the Washington Examiner and Rusty Reno from First Things on the state of the country and the state of conservatism. What did you make of the conversation?
I went into it sort of thinking they would disagree a lot more than they ended up disagreeing, right? They really did come down to these sort of three things, as you put it: faith, family, and local community. And I think that is sort of a very it's a succinct way of kind of summing up some of the core of conservatism. And it was interesting to see just how much they had in common, despite they're sort of coming from different sides of the movement, as it were. Yeah,
and I think the neat thing about both of them is they really do view faith, family, and community as sort of the ends that we're aiming for as a society. It's Tim leans a little bit more towards the libertarian side, and Rusty's a little bit more of a common good conservative or a populist at times. But I think they really did provide an important framework. I think at a time when conservatives seem to be divided about nearly everything, I think defining our ends can really help us to have more enlightened discussions about what means we should take to pursue them. So, I thought the conversation was fascinating, and I wish both of them the best with the work that they're doing at their respective institutions. So before we move on to the interview with Tim and Rusty, just want to say a brief word about this show. Our podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. The mission of ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to join us in that mission, head over to isi.org and join for free to get exclusive offers, content, the Intercollegiate Review, and this podcast in your inbox every week. Now, let's get on to the interview.
Good evening, and welcome to Conservative Conversations with ISI. My name is Johnny Burtka, and I am the president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and I'm joined by my colleague James Davenport for an exciting conversation with some esteemed guests tonight on the future of America and the future of conservatism. Before I get to the introductions, one housekeeping note. You'll see there is a spot for questions on the platform, big marker that we're using. So feel free to put your questions in there, and in the last 15 to 20 minutes of the show, we will get to those. So we are joined by two guests, Tim Carney, who's a senior political columnist at the Washington Examiner and a resident fellow at AEI, and Rusty Reno, who is the editor of First Things. Tim has a recent book that I would highly recommend called Alienated America: While Some Places Thrive and Others Collapse, which I'm sure we'll touch on tonight. And Rusty also has an interesting book, Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. Welcome, Tim. Welcome, Rusty.
Great to be with you.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being here tonight. We'll kick things off with a question for each of you. What do you think are the primary threats facing America today? And in light of that, what issues do you think that conservatives should prioritize the most during the Biden years?
I'll kick off. I think the primary threat is that our little platoons are under attack from without and from within, that government and the media are hostile to not just church, but any sort of local community, little platoon. You see all over the media people worrying that some of us might get together and they not be able to spy on us and fact check us, that there are private conversations happening outside the reach of CNN's ears. And you see the effort by the left to drive the church groups from the public square, that you're allowed to have freedom of worship, but not be, really involved in civil society if you don't obey the left's sexual morality. And our institutions are sort of destroying themselves to some extent, and people are choosing to peel away for all sorts of reasons that conservatives and even non-conservatives like Robert Putnam have been talking about for years. And if you've read any of your Tocqueville or your Aristotle, for that matter, you know that the erosion of our little platoons is absolutely going to lead to all sorts of other, and has started leading to all sorts of other maladies.
Yeah, I think I would put Tim's point maybe even more abstractly and say that the root of our problems is the growing mistrust that the many have for the few. I mean, every society has to have leaders, and we often use the term elite as a pejorative, but in fact, part of ISI's mission is to train leaders for the future of American society. And so as I see it, and to Tim's point about media, the universities, government itself, that as documented by Charles Murray, people at the top of society now live in fundamentally detached way from the people that they purport to lead. And so this seems to me to be the deepest source of our dysfunction. And populism as a movement is really a symptom of rebellion, or a sign of rebellion, that the people who would normally accept the leadership of the few are rising up and saying, no, I don't trust these people to actually look after my own interests.
And Tim and Rusty, what do you think are the primary causes of this?
Rusty, you go ahead first on this one.
Yeah, I think, at the end of the Cold War, the Russians famously said, oh, you will regret that you no longer have us around, the Soviet commissars. And there's an element of truth to that. I mean, the Cold War was a consolidating force for American society. The people on the top needed the people in the middle in order to, populate the army or produce the raw material to, conduct the Cold War. So the end of the Cold War did relieve that kind of consolidating pressure. And then it also triggered globalization, and the process of globalization has led to the capacity of people at the top of society to have interests in a global system that doesn't actually work very well for people in the middle or at the bottom of American society.
Yeah, and I'll steer Rusty's last comment. The fact is that the elites have been able to become convinced that they are not a tribe. And this has enabled them to sort of try to wage a war on tribalism. I remember reading a journalist who was so upset by Brexit a few years ago. And he was just denouncing the tribalism of, these fishermen out in Sussex or whatever. And then he just said, they have no idea how this will affect me and my friends. And he describes himself sitting around a table. He doesn't even remember what country it was in, where they're all, getting together. All these guys who got their master's degree together, or they're all journalists from 14 different countries, and he thought that he was the untribal one because cosmopolitanism and tribalism are supposedly opposites. Well, obviously this was a very specific tribe that they belonged to. And so elites believing that they are above tribe, I don't think it's a new thing. I think our WASPs were to some extent guilty of that 50, 60, 70 years ago. But I still think a lot of them sort of realize, okay, this is an elite tribe that I'm part of. But nowadays they think they're not. So they think that dismantling our attachments, our bitter clingings to the things that matter in the daily life of other people is a noble undertaking. And so that's I think the difference between today and 60 years ago.
And I mean, do you think going back to the elites, let's say at the time of the turn of the 20th century, or even like the founding fathers, I mean, was there a conscience sense that, I am part of the elite class. People are going to have to be dependent on me, whether it's workers or community members. And so I need to, have the education, the skill set needed to take care of people. Was that a conscious thing? And is that something that, is no longer, do they acknowledge that anymore? Or?
No, I think the main unacknowledged thing by the elites is the nature of their privilege, of our privilege. I mean, I was my father was a lawyer. I was raised first in Greenwich Village and then Westchester County, New York. And it was easy not to realize that, like, mom signing me up for Little League was a big deal. Mom and dad picking a public school district with lots of involved parents, with teachers who would stay afterwards and get involved in your life, with dad running for public office in town and roping his kids into his campaign, that these were extraordinary things, and that the things we belonged to was like the air that we breathe. That was sort of the image that J.D. Vance used. And I think so many of the elites don't realize that their privilege is not a higher income. It's not what they learned in the classroom in Harvard. It's that they're, as Murray described in Coming Apart, it's that the super zips that they're in actually are super in ways that conservatives really care about, which is strong community cohesion. You go to a Little League in Chevy Chase, Maryland, where like Brett Kavanaugh and Jane Mayer and all these people live. It's not like totally depopulated because the aloof elites are off, being elite. Like the coaches are like the clerks for Kavanaugh and the former CEOs of multinational corporations. I mean, they don't appreciate that their privilege is their connection and belonging and cohesion that was more accessible to the middle class 50 years ago. And so they don't think that that's what they need to share with the rest of the population.
Yeah, I would say that, the old WASP elite knew it was a tribe. And so the notion of noblesse oblige is that to them that have been given much is expected. There have been two dynamics in the last two generations that have undermined that. One is the notion of merit, so that the people at the top are not just lucky in the way that Tim described, but they actually deserve everything that they have, so that in a certain sense, they don't owe society anything. And the other asset has been the ideology of diversity. And so here it's the notion that, well, if the elite looks like the rest of the country, then it's kind of done its job in terms of representing its interests. And so the symbolism of diversity is often used as a way of shirking the responsibilities of leadership. Because I agree with Tim, that sort of the deepest problem facing America is the erosion of the middle class, economically, but also culturally and spiritually. Decline of the family, decline of community, lack of community involvement. And so really it's imperative for those who are leading our country to recognize that they need to use their position of power and take responsibility for rebuilding and renewing the middle.
Yeah, so one of the things you both just mentioned is the family. Let's dive a little bit deeper there. I mean, that's something that that conservatives have they've valued for a long time, right? That's always been something conservatives have valued. So how do we, in today's culture with this problem of elite and the erosion of the middle, how do we strengthen the family? And I mean, maybe we could even talk a little bit about Senator Romney's plan and whether or not you think that would help.
Well, I think there's very little that the federal government can do to strengthen the family, but there's certainly ways in which the government can maybe nudge the needle or at least remove obstacles from it. But the wise wisdom I repeated in my book, and I say all the time, is that it takes a village to raise a child. We have 6 kids, and right now, so that
that is a village.
Yes, so that I can do this, we're relying on a television, but so that in general we can have a family, we rely on our parish, on the schools and that sort of thing. Neighbors are indispensable for a lot of people for raising kids. Strong communities, little platoons, institutions of civil society that have eroded, that's what makes it impossible to raise kids. And when people talk about here's the cost of raising a kid, they don't include that for a lot of people there's like free babysitting from grandma or a ride from the next door neighbor, and that gets priced in. So that's the first thing, is if somehow we can rebuild community. I just wrote a piece, though, that I think one of the benefits of Mitt Romney's plan, which is basically replace a lot of the welfare stuff and the tax credits for children with a single big, $350 or $250 a month check for each kid. One of the worries by conservative economists is, well, this could reduce labor force participation, which in some cases, if a guy's like, I don't have to work, I got $300 or $700 more dollars, I can play video games, that's bad. If a mom says, I don't have to work, my husband will keep working and I can stay home with the kids, or heck, I'll be very liberated. If the dad says that, I'm going to stay home with my kids while my wife makes some money, either one of these, that would be a benefit. To have more stay-at-home moms or dads would be good for the family. It would be good for the community to have a mom out on the front porch yelling at Johnny for being an idiot, or a dad out there to hit fly balls to Jimmy in the field. That conservatives need to make sure that we're not elevating the intermediate goods, such as a strong economy, over the ultimate goods.
Yeah, I'm not a policy guy, so the details of Romney's proposal, of course, need to be thought over and what the implications might be. But as I see it, here I live in New York City, and so in New York we have the Liberal Project, which is free pre-K education, which is effectively providing free childcare. And I think this is an incentive, or this supports more female participation in the workforce. I think it's an upper middle class model imposed upon working class women.
Yep.
So in that sense, I think the Romney thing, for all the, Tim mentioned some of the potential abuses or problems, and we got to design it in a way to try to minimize that. But this strikes me as the right conservative counter to free childcare. And that is to say, no, the government's not going to decide how to spend the money to try to support families. We want families to make their own decisions about how to spend these resources to promote what they conceive of as best for their family. So I think that fits conservative principles. Milton Friedman, he argued for, a kind of check to people rather than social programs. Because it means the individual decides how to spend it rather than government planners deciding what's best for you. So I think that something along this Romney idea is really worth exploring, and I think it's a promising development on the right. It takes a plan to beat a plan. And so insofar as the left has plans about how to subsidize an individualistic, this sort of Julia approach to life, from that ad campaign of the Obama campaign, where government programs support you at every step of the way, we have to have some way of actually saying to people, no, we know it's difficult in the current climate to raise a family. We will help provide you with resources, but we want to provide you with choices. So I think it's kind of like the idea of school choice. except scaled up really. And I think that check could have a big marginal effect on people's decisions to attend parochial schools, because that's a big chunk of change that Rami's talking about. And so that could be, and if you have tuitions for kids for private schools, that could make a big difference in terms of private school enrollments, which I think would be a good to break down the monopoly of government schools in working class neighborhoods.
So just to get a little bit more kind of specific on the nature of civil society and then the family and sort of why we consider that to be in decline. It seems like we're in agreement that at least outside of these super zips, that those institutions are in decline. I want to press a little bit more though on what the root causes of that are. So I mean, I think there's probably in my mind, there's probably 4 or 5, right? You have the government, could be one, technology, new technology, culture, or the economy. Right. And I know Rusty has talked about the right and the left. The right has pursued economic deregulation while the left pursues cultural regulation. I know Tim has sort of made a little bit of a counterpoint to that, saying, if you go out in Trump country and you look at, a lot of these old factory towns, the reason that families are hurting, it's not because the factory closed. It's primarily because civil society has crumbled. So can you guys, get a little more specific about what you think caused the decline of civil society and the family?
Well, I mean, sure, there's not going to be any one individual cause there. And as you indicated, I think that you have this kind of double whammy of, creative destruction in a vibrant economy can be a very good thing. As we know, but it has a negative externality, which is that it affects the communities that grow up around old industries, and so we have to think carefully about how to remediate the consequences of creative destruction, to maintain a vibrant economy, but also provide continuity of communities in the midst of that rapid economic change. But the element of cultural deregulation, it seems like an unnecessary, for a social conservative like me, I look at it and think, what are you thinking, American elites? You're going to reinvent sexual morality at the same time that you're going to unleash this rapid technological and economic change of globalization and technology. So I think it's really whipsawed middle class Americans.
Yeah, and there's a million ways we could talk about it. In Alienated America, I sort of use Tocqueville's framing of a over-centralization being the flip side of the coin of hyper-individualism. They sound like opposites, and a lot of people think, if you read your Ayn Rand, you might think, collectivism and individualism are the two competing forces, but they're the opposite sides of the same coin, is what's going on, and that the enemy of both is the communal, the institution of civil society, the sort of voluntary, again, little platoon. But since Rusty sort of brought up the international trade, that kind of thing, the classical model of economics is that the one thing that all economists agreed on was that free trade benefits both nations. And I still think that's true, but I think that nations might not be the proper level for measuring this.
But Tim, you could say that, I agree, it benefits both nations, but we have a nation of 330 plus million people. Yeah. And so it may benefit our nation, but it could be that only 10% of our nation really reaps those benefits. And the other 90% not so much. Yeah, and I think this is where we need to think as a body politic about are we willing to forgo some benefit in order to have those benefits more widely spread, or at least spread to those kinds of communities that are hurting the most. Now, I think the left's idea is, I think the modern Democratic Party is the party of the rich. And it's the party of Silicon Valley, it's the party of Hollywood, it's the party of Wall Street. And so their approach is going to be to keep gunning the engines in the global economy and then increase taxes and redistribute more of the wealth to those who have lost out. I don't like that solution, because it means that you create an ever larger class of dependent people. My hope is that we can think about economic policy in a way that we can repatriate some manufacturing in the United States and increase opportunity for high wage employment for high school educated Americans so that they're self-sufficient. And I think self-sufficient people, to your point, Tim, are more likely to sustain independent mediating institutions.
And that's right. That sort of dependence and independence, like we say government dependence, that's a fine term, but the fact is that we're all dependent. I was bragging earlier, I built the door behind me, and every conservative, when you say I built that, thinks of Barack Obama saying you didn't build that, right? But it was Adam Smith who said I didn't build this. Very simply, there are nails and screws in this door. I did not make the nails and screws. So just believing in capitalism is believing in depending on others. And certainly believing in community is believing even in family is believing in depending on others. So sort of overcoming individualism is, I think, an important part of what the conservative project has to do these days. But specifically on trade, I think, again, what happened in these former steel towns wasn't that the former steel workers moved into a service sector job with slightly lower equilibrium wages that were largely offset by lower prices of manufactured goods. Happened in these towns is these men fell on their rear ends. Their children didn't get married. Their daughters have kids out of wedlock, and their grandkids died of opioid overdose. Like, these places got demolished. It was not a slight downturn for Uniontown, Pennsylvania in exchange for cheaper sneakers for the rest of us. It was social devastation that resulted in people dying of these deaths of despair, people living lives without a dad, and people trying to raise kids without a husband, etc. And men living life without anybody really feeling that they needed them. So my problem, though, again, if I'm a libertarian, it's because I'm a conservative. I don't know that there's a government program that could have saved those factories. Maybe there was, but there's certainly not one, I don't think, that can bring it back. But I would say reliable, like, just think about it. You show up to work, you get the job, and you have this idea that for the next 30 years, you're safe. The reason somebody like me hustles for, like, if I get a bestseller, that'll be great. Not because I want to buy a lake house, but because I get a bestseller, I know I'm fine for the next 30 years. If that was provided to me by U.S. Steel, that's a really good way of life. So this is how the creative destruction, the dynamism of capitalism can definitely seem at odds with what we know is good, which is planting roots, building a family, and being committed to where you are and who you're supposed to be responsible for, which are the people physically proximate to you.
Although I got to say, I mean, the Germans have done a good job of maintaining industrial continuity and also economic growth. I think it's not a choice of either capitalism or not capitalism. We have all these very, very often small but cumulatively significant policy decisions that we make as a country that I think we can revisit them. I think it's a question of adjustment, not any kind of radical change there. But to the cultural issue, I mean, I think we could revisit, how we regulate internet pornography, or, so the demise of many institutions that were established in the post-war era to try to keep the excessive, the grosser elements of our society out of mass media, they all kind of collapsed in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. And that was a decision that we made, that our elite made, actually. It wasn't like it just happened. Laws were passed that were court decisions were made. And I think they should be revisited. Yeah.
And that somebody, I forget who it was, came up with an idea a couple of years ago, was that every internet connection you get by default should filter out all pornography. And that if you want the porn, you can opt in. So, like, you have to call the company and say, yeah, I want the porn account. So there you preserve the freedom of speech, if you want to call it speech, but you filter it out and you protect almost every kid.
It seems like a no-brainer, but we cannot seem to make a single smidgen of progress on this. The Brits tried to do this, but it was defeated by the pornography lobby. So it's within our power as a body politic to tighten up our cultural norms, if you will. But it's going to require us to put pressure on our political leaders to get it done. I mean, my view is, just in the terms of the cultural policy, if you call it, is we need to make normal again. And sadly, this current administration is determined to, press the most extreme cultural progressivism, which again, it valorizes the most marginal modes of life, the most marginal lifestyles. And this just further undermines the transmission of sort of basic, sensible cultural norms from generation to generation.
So how long can that cycle go on? I mean, eventually you have to think that would, the cultural deregulation, like it's got to spin out of control or undo the system, or there's got to be a backlash. Is there any end in sight?
And I think Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, he documents the capacity of the elite to walk talk the talk of the 60s while they walk the walk of the 50s. And so, we have the super zips that Tim was mentioning that effectively wall themselves off from the consequences of the cultural policies that they impose on the rest of the populace. I think this could last for quite a long time. In fact, I think if I was advising the elite on how to insulate themselves from any political challenge, I would say do everything you can to demoralize the body politic and make people, atomized, addicted, dysfunctional, and they will never be able to unite in order to challenge the power of the elite. Mm-hmm. So I think it can go on for a long time. It's going to just require us to say, no, that's not the kind of society we want to live in.
Yeah, I never think, the pendulum's going to swing back. I still remember, what was it, 7 years ago? Or when was it? Well, not too long ago, we'd see these protesters on campus getting really upset that they were exposed to an opposing view, and there was always this conservative chuckle saying, these people are going to be for a rude awakening when they enter the real world. Next thing you know, the editor of the New York Times opinion page gets fired because he ran a bad op-ed. No, we had the rude awakening. Like, I don't see things sort of swinging back by nature. I feel like the transgender thing is so far and so averse to just the common sentiment of human nature that there's got to be a backlash. I don't see it happening.
So some of the subtleties that are being pulled out between the points that you guys are making are the sort of some of the differences that we're seeing on the right today, where we're seeing some people sort of cling to the old kind of fusionist consensus and others sort of calling for a new consensus in American conservatism. And so I wanted to ask you guys, in light of the public discourse editorial recently, I don't know if you guys saw that, but they were asking, it's called Toward a New Consensus. And one of the questions they ask is, what are the aims that are shared in common between the different conservative camps? Is there common ground? What are the sort of things that we might be able to build on to have a new conservative coalition that maybe doesn't look identical to the old fusionism, but can help us sort of achieve political and cultural victory in some areas?
I would think the main thing is priorities and stating aims and that kind of thing. That you got to tell the economists, you guys go up there and you put the yokes on your back because the economy's here to serve what matters, which is family, faith, and community. And I think that a form of that could be politically winning, but that, and there were elements in the Trump administration early on. Basically, Steve Bannon could give all of this lip service very eloquently. He said, countries have economies, not the other way around. That the Catholic teaching is that an economy is a service to people, but it's become a god. It's become a god for a lot of the people on the right. And so I don't know, that maybe I'm just bitterly clinging to my fusionism. But I would just want to make sure that it's clear that our free enterprise, it reflects a deeper truth that you shouldn't interfere with people freely doing trade. But sometimes we articulate that in a way that elevates autonomy above the idea of a common good. And so my fusionism would just sort of, instead of being an equality of free enterprise and a social conservatism, would be saying we believe in free enterprise in almost every case. We think government's too big because what's really good often gets trampled by big government.
Yeah, I think the basic coalition will remain. It'll get reinvented. This is the 21st century. It's not the 20th century. The things that Tim said, I think, are people. There's an increasing awareness of the need to make our dynamic tradition of free market capitalism work for the widest possible variety of Americans in different stations of life. And I think most conservatives would agree that that's an admirable goal that we need to pursue. So, but I would say that one of the ways that I've thought about it is, freedom is a very important American word, very important conservative word. And as I think about it, we live in a society that, wow, it's so, the sort of woke conformism, I think that's going to be a very unifying factor on the right. And in fact, I think there's going to be a kind of equivalent of the neoconservative left to right movement on the part of anti-woke liberals that are going to wind up joining us, as not agreeing with us on many things, but agreeing that no, the greatest problem facing the country is this kind of tyranny of the woke. So I'm actually kind of optimistic that, that people at Reason Magazine can work with people at First Things Magazine, and can also work with people who have hived off from the New York, have been run out of the New York Times.
So I have not worries about, I want to bring people on board, and it's good to have someone who disagrees with me fighting against me being canceled or censored. But a very interesting trait among, and nobody's written this article, so maybe, Ross Douthat could write it in 20 minutes, but maybe if I think about it for a month, I can write it. But the Rousseauian streak in the anti-woke left. In other words, some of the things that I'm saying, the most important thing to nail down in conservatism and to play up, that individual autonomy is not everything. That when we say the religious nature of wokeism, we don't mean that religion itself is bad, but some of our friends on the anti-woke left do. And the hyper individualism, so identity politics, we know what we mean when we talk about the left's destructive identity politics, or even a right-wing populist, how that can go into a destructive identity politics. But on the other hand, my boss at AEI, Yuval Levin, he talks about how where we get our identity, he doesn't put it this way, but what I got from his book, A Time to Build, was where we get our identity properly is from roles that we play in the things that we belong to. So in other words, my understanding of myself is not like some Cartesian thing from me sitting in a room, but it's me saying, okay, I am a dad in my family. I am a T-ball coach in my Catholic parish. I have this role to play at AEI and this role to play at the Washington Examiner, and I'm connected to ISI and IHS and these other groups. So yeah, kind of the group that I'm in is where I'm getting my identity from. And you'll see the anti-woke left, God bless them, saying, you are just you. You are a human. And that's that hyper individualism that we have to worry about. That's almost the life of Julia talk to some extent, where it's just you alone in this vast world.
For me, the argument is that, back to this notion of freedom, to your point, Tim, that we want, as a conservative, I would like us to encourage a society where people can govern their own lives. And to do that, I think Yuval Levin, makes a good point in Time to Build, is that actually the capacity of self-government, you have to have a foundation. And I think that, otherwise you'll actually become, easily suborned by advertising or, endless temptations and addictions and compulsions and things like that. So to be free, we have to have a solid place to stand. And I think obviously as a religious person, I think the firmest foundation is supernatural. It's our faith, but also it's family and community and the institutions we care about. These all provide us with solid places to stand. And I think this is necessary in order to maintain a free society in a time of increased globalization and technological flux. All the more important to sustain these institutions and structures in people's lives. It's actually the source of freedom.
Yeah, and I wonder if I could just follow up on that quick. It sounds like you're almost sort of drawing a fence there, Tim, right? Saying, the conservative movement kind of ends here. And I wonder if you guys have any opinions, where, like someone in the chat was just talking about Buckley and the Birchers, right? Like, where are the lines that we're going to draw moving forward in the movement?
Well, I think one lesson we need to learn is not to let the left define who is acceptable and who is unacceptable, and then have us perform the executions.
Yeah.
One of my policies is never, ever, ever be the one who's performs the executions ordered by the New York Times. So I think that's really hugely important. And I think we should also learn that, there are all kinds of goofy, the John Birch Society era, that's not the world we live in right now. Lots of crazy, goofy, deluded people on the right. And the left also has all kinds of crazy, deluded people. How do they deal with them? They try to understand what motivates them. They try to say, okay, all right, we don't want extremism, but what is the root issue that we need to address as liberals in order to, address, the root causes of riots and protests and all that kind of stuff. And we on the right need to say, all right, so QAnon, like what's going on with that? Why are people so susceptible? How could we as responsible leaders actually address that need rather than being in this policing activity of somehow ruling them out and driving them out of the room? I think that's a huge mistake.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the policing, and with the conspiracy theories and that sort of thing. I think that those are fruits of alienation, the very thing that we were talking about. People who, and some of these people maybe weren't alienated. Some of these people maybe were running the potlucks every Friday until exactly 1 year ago or 11 months ago. And that 11 months of being locked up, maybe they've got a bunch of kids driving them crazy, or maybe it's just a solitude driving them crazy. And the time on the internet, the fundamentalism that becomes possible when you're isolated gets really smoothed off if you're actually out in civil society and dealing with other people. So I think somehow a project of helping to rebuild people in their local communities, starting now, but especially as these restrictions on our being social animals gets lifted in the coming weeks, God willing, that will be the way to do it. Again, Rusty pointed out, the left always talks about what are the root causes of this. Well, I think that's a good way to think about it. Not just excluding people or saying we have no place for those guys, but sometimes, again, with the Heritage Foundation had an unfortunate argument against a higher minimum wage today, which was this could drive up the cost of childcare and cause some mothers to drop out of the labor force and raise their kids instead. I'm like, I'm not lobbying for a $15 minimum wage, but that's the best argument for a $15 minimum wage I could think of. We have to make sure we don't let sort of the people with just the green eye shades be in charge. But we certainly can't tell them you're not allowed to be in our movement. We just have to say, that's an unpersuasive argument. We're not going to maximize GDP over the common good.
Yeah, to follow up on Tim's point, I don't think it's a question of who's in and who's out. It's really a question of who plays lead guitar and who plays rhythm guitar. And as I look at my lifetime, right, I voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980. We really needed to loosen things up economically and let the creative juices of these baby boomers who are coming into peak productive years really let the thoroughbreds run. We face very different problems in the 21st century. I think the problems are these disintegrating institutions, lack of solidarity, isolation, enemy, and so forth. And I think in this situation, I think, we need to consolidate. We need to reconsolidate as a nation economically, but we also need to reconsolidate as a nation culturally and morally and spiritually. And we all feel that polarization as a way of talking about a deconsolidated nation. And so things like patriotism, local community that Tim emphasizes, these sorts of things are things around which conservatives have a natural affinity with that kind of language. And I think it resonates with what Americans want. And, my view is if anybody's willing to join me in that, if they, but they have to accept that that's the priority that we're shooting for in the 2020s. And I think it's going to be a long process of rebuilding.
And that shouldn't be a hard thing. It is, though, and this relates to something I started off referring to. There were like 4 articles in the last week worrying about what's that audio chat app. You guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So they're saying there's a bunch of people getting together on social media, but because it's not being recorded, we can't hold them accountable for what they say. This like democratize everything. Clubhouse is the name of it, but it's this effort to democratize everything. It's the idea that, and I got asked this all the time. It says, how can I belong? Because in Alienated America, I argue for a real great awakening, getting people back in church. I say, how can I belong to a church that doesn't fully embrace who I am? And I was thinking, the people want everything they belong to endorse everything that they are. Now, with a church, maybe that makes sense. But you know what? I listened to Bruce Springsteen knowing that he did not agree with me on, on various issues. On being a conservative who's anti-war, half of the writer, Charles Krauthammer, I admired him as the best. Bob Novak and he and George Will, the 3 best. I thought Krauthammer was totally wrong on foreign policy. I didn't need everybody to be with me on everything. And I live in Silver Spring, Maryland. Down the road is Kent Mill, a Jewish neighborhood. I helped rally them to join us against the county's efforts to shut down our non-public schools. When I was talking to people in Kent Mill, I knew what my role was. I knew that they and I disagreed on very fundamental, the most fundamental things, and that I didn't get to call any shots when I was there. I got to be a role player. I got to be the guy who throws the inbounds pass, and that's about it. And that in parts of our life, we can join in meaningful work and then break off and say, see you again soon. That's something that our modern, like democratized, demand accountability from everything mindset doesn't allow for, because we're sort of shedding the habit of having little platoons that we can belong to. And so I think that a Big Tent conservatism welcomes in, Yasha Monk and other anti-woke leftists and just says, by the way, we'll defend your free speech while we're disagreeing on the essentialness of community and faith.
Absolutely. And so we'll get to now our question that we'll ask all our guests before we jump into the Q&A a little bit here. So one of the things we're primarily interested in here at ISI is conservatism. So I wonder if you guys could just, in a sentence or two, say what you think, whether or not you consider yourself a conservative and what you think that means.
For me, conservatism is a affirmation of the role of authority in the good life. So for me, as a religious person, in fact, First Things Magazine, I think, unites Jews, Catholics, Protestants. We have Muslim writers, and we're all united in the belief that an ever deeper obedience to God is a fundamentally humanizing project. And so conservatism as a political and social vision is that the authority of the parents over children, teachers over students, the authority that, the people or positions of responsibility rightly exercise, that this is essential for a humane life. So the dignity and importance of authority, I think that's essential to conservatism.
I think that's really good. I don't tend to emphasize the word authority as much. I do emphasize tradition, community, and family. And I guess it's the same as authority when I say understanding that playing our proper roles in these human level institutions is the path to a lasting happiness. Eudaimonia was the Greek word that Aristotle used. And that we need to guard against an over-centralization and a hyper-individualism, and that conservatism is an intellectual humility that allows us to accept, A, that we have roles to play in life, B, that tradition sometimes knows things that we don't.
That's great. Diving into some of the questions from our audience, Jane is asking, which I think relates to the faith point both of you made. A number of the founders explicitly addressed virtue as a critical component of society. Yep. Without a faith ingredient, i.e. denial of self, hard work, giving to others, etc., how do we get virtue?
Virtue is possible without faith. You can have, an incomplete understanding of human nature can be 90% correct or something. That's a wrong percentage, but that I know lots of people who are moralistic, frankly, who believe that good habits, that virtue leads to happiness, that there is something like a human nature, though they would never say it that way. But, and what I argue in the book is that virtue is infertile without God and without faith, and that they're unable to spread it because it becomes best practices. So again, this is a lot of our elites, fairly secular, although they go to church more than you would think, but they're engaging in best practices. They know the success sequence that the economists at Brookings turn out is true, but that's not a convincing argument. That virtue is sort of the path to happiness that God gave us because he loves us is a more convincing argument. So I think people are capable of virtue without faith. I think it would be great if all the secular people in this country started talking about virtue more. I think it'll be an infertile virtue if it's just passed down as best practices.
So we have a question from Michael here, and he says, in the 1990s, it seemed like Republicans were the party of ideas. What happened? It seems clueless. It seems that people are clueless in dealing with real problems America face. How can it get back its intellectual vibrancy?
Well, and let's be fair here. I think that the 21st century has shown that both the left, center left, and the center right have been very disoriented. So the Obama years, good grief. It was, I think you look back on those 8 years and you kind of marvel at how disoriented, how little was accomplished. And so I guess I'm kind of forgiving here. It's just part of the, we're all groping to try to understand as I say, the way I think about it is the post-war era is ending. That tremendous, the sort of grooves were cut very deeply in our body politic in the 50s and 60s as we recovered from the war and established our political priorities and economic priorities. And that era is ending, and we're all disoriented. So I guess I want to counsel here, not being too harsh in our judgment of the conservative movement in the 90s and the aughts. But we should become more harsh now, which is that, okay, we need to wake up and realize we need to have a conservatism oriented towards the problems of the 21st century, not towards the problems of the 20th century.
Yeah, we had 2 wins and a loss. We beat the commies, and it was awesome. And it was awesome because even though they tried to deny it, we could point to the left and say, you guys were wrong. Like, I had this poster an ISI poster in my room with all the liberal economists and New York Times op-ed editors saying, like, the Soviet Union is not now, nor will it be in the foreseeable future, in trouble. And Ronald Reagan, he said it. No one believed him. I mean, it was just awesome. We were spiking that football for years, right? Beating the commies and the left was awesome. And we kind of won on deregulation and all that stuff. And so we were left to fight over, traditional values, and the religious right rose up. And, and then we said, the president of the United States having a sexual affair with an intern half his age in the Oval Office and lying about it is bad. And the whole elite culture stood up and said, no, you're prudes, shut up. And we lost. In 1998, the Democrats gained seats in the House. Like, Bill Clinton was treated as a rock star in the media until, basically about 2 years ago, he was the rock star of the Democratic Party. And so that put us in this place where the two things we wanted to fight for, we had basically won, the economic and the foreign policy. So we tried to redo that with let's make Saddam Hussein be the new communism or whatever. And then we said, okay, so we gave up on the whole being prudes thing and nominated our own thrice divorced proud philanderer. I mean, that's I think the two wins and the loss can tell the whole story.
I could say also that part of the problem is that the Republican Party became a donorocracy over the last 20 years. And then 2016 was important in the sense that Trump's nomination the donorocracy lost its grip on the party, and I don't think it's coming back. And moreover, I think donors they also want what's best for the country, and there's been a real reorientation in thinking in a lot of important conservative donors, which I take encouragement from.
Do you feel like sort of in the light of the populism that's risen in the past 4 or 5 years? Do you feel that Beltway conservative organizations? You would think that their main base, right, are the sort of the red-blooded, sort of Trump supporting Republicans in the heartland and the South. I mean, is there a it seems to me like the people in those places, have desires and expectations for what happens in Washington. Do you think Beltway conservative institutions are they successfully taking those sort of desires and are they serving their constituents? Are they able to kind of refine those sentiments into something that is, I don't know, perhaps more winsome and will be more effective, or are they tone deaf when it comes to their constituency?
One of the things I've learned is that intellectuals are long on their ideas and they're not willing to sell at a loss, and so it's just. You develop it's like you got your songbook and you're going to sing out of your songbook as a intellectual, so no, my answer is no. I don't think the conservative institutions have done a good job of reorienting and pivoting towards the issues and problems of the 2020s.
Well, I'm the Beltway conservative here, guy, so I'll speak up for us. I ran the commentary page at the Washington Examiner. I got promoted to that job right after the election in 2016. And I said, the boss asked me what I was going to do. And I said, I don't think my beliefs are going to change. And I don't think the Examiner's beliefs are going to change. But we need to learn from this election. The country was not what we thought it was. Like, none of us predicted that Trump was going to win the nomination, and almost none of us predicted that he was going to win the general election in 2016. And so there was something about the country that we didn't know. And I said, we should learn from that. We should adapt our priorities. We made nationalism a bigger thing. We tried to steer nationalism towards something that was more conservative and more coherent than what we thought was coming out of some of the other nationalists' mouths at the time. And at the American Enterprise Institute, when in the last couple of years, we established a whole new section on it's called Constitutional and Cultural Studies, and Yuval Levin runs it. And like the idea that AEI has a real concern about culture, with people like Michael Dougherty and Ross Douthat and me in there, like who elevate family and faith and community above all. This is an attempt by us to say, all right, the fights that we were fighting before, We now have to have different emphases and that kind of thing. Is there still a lot of tone deafness? Yeah, because a lot of us, were started and were hired to fight a certain fight 20 years ago. I hope ISI is adapting as well. That even 12 years ago, the fight against Biden isn't the same as the fight against Obama. And some of the fight against Obama, we were fighting the wrong fight. So there's a need to adapt. It's not being met fully, but I think there's a lot of good efforts.
And Tim,
there.
just to add, I wasn't throwing shade at your efforts in particular, because I think all those people that you named as part of your Yuval's new center at AI are people who have invitations to speak at ISI events in the next 6 months. So I'm aware of the good work that you're doing, and of course all the good work that Rusty's been doing at First Thing. So thank you guys.
Yeah. So I want to ask a question here from Sheldon. Sheldon asks, the cultural norms that you guys are talking about have been affected or taken over by media and tech companies. How can we change that? How can we work against that? He's sort of talking about cultural norms being degraded by media and tech companies, whether it's by silencing speech or just by the sheer existence of the tech. So what do you guys think about that?
Well, the sheer existence is the toughest one to overcome. I mean, again, man is fallen, and you give us these little machines that are designed by very smart people to be literally addictive, and that they're mostly destructive. There are upsides. There are definitely upsides to all this tech, and a virtual community is better than no community, and it could be literally life-saving during this pandemic. But virtual community often tends to crowd out real human life community. And in that regard, it's absolutely destructive. But it crowds it out, not through force, like government, but through sucking us in. Again, our fallen nature, it's making it easier for us to make the wrong choice, to detach from the people around us, to centralize our attention towards things that we can't do anything about. And so I have a sort of hopeful thing there, which is human society, American society, tends to adjust and adapt to technological shocks. And that maybe 10 years from now, we'll say, oh, Facebook is mostly the way that I plan get-togethers with my friends. Or Twitter is mostly just what I do to make sure that I'm curating a few stories every day, and most people aren't out there posting and flame warring and that sort of thing. So that's my possible optimistic read on how that would happen.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at late 19th century populism, William James Bryant, the Grange movement in the Midwest, that was a huge battle against railroads, which were seen as abusive and manipulative. And there's something of a parallel here with tech, it seems to me. And, again, I think we do exactly as Tim said and sort of make sure that we gain some control of our own lives in relation to technology, but also we should think politically about how to put guardrails up. I think maybe we should have a special tax on internet commerce in order to restrain its ability to completely swallow Main Street America. Because I think, we don't really want to live in a society where the only retail outlets are the gas and go stations at the internet, at the interstate exchanges. So it will take a political intelligence on our part to think about how to build some guardrails to prevent these excesses from overwhelming us and overwhelming the things that we really care about in our society.
But the guardrails have always been, in all aspects of our life, on the human and community level. Like, I remember Tucker Carlson saying we should outlaw social media accounts for people under 18 or 16, and Congress should do it. And my first reaction is that's a horrible idea. Of course, Congress can't make it illegal for me to help my 16-year-old, post something online. But my other thought was, my wife and I don't do that by ourselves. We have help. We send our kids to schools and immerse them in social circles where nobody's doing this. And so we don't rely on the federal government to do it, but we also don't think on our own we can pull off this task of keeping children away from this horribly addictive stuff. So that's one part of it. And on the tech censorship, it's funny. Are we going to make Twitter bake the cake they don't want to bake? They just kicked off O'Keefe, the Project Veritas guy, for violating a rule that they allow New York Times writers to violate every day of posting somebody's personal information. And are we going to say you have to host Dan O'Keefe? No more than we can say that a baker has to cater a gay wedding to some extent.
I think that you've got strong arguments that Twitter is a common carrier in a way that the local bake shop is not a common carrier. I think that, people can think these things through, and, just like the person running a shopping mall is not the same as, the shopping mall is not private property in the same way that my front yard is private property. So I think we can make nuanced distinctions here and exercise our political will to, as a people, in a way that respects the best of our traditions as a country, our traditions of freedom and our traditions of private property. But we don't have to just abandon our political efforts to try to make our environment saner and sounder. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do those things that you want us to do in our local communities, Tim, and we can also take modest but significant measures in governmental action.
So just to kind of sum up and conclude our conversation, I think in terms of what there's a lot I know that you all agree on. It seems like faith, family, and local community really have the primacy. And then there are sort of shades of difference in terms of, things like the free market should work towards promoting those ends. The government obviously has guardrails, but also it's probably the most important source of guardrails comes from, faith and family and those sort of boundaries that are put up in our local communities. So I hope you think that's a fair summary of our discussion.
Yes.
And on that note, we'll conclude this evening with Conservative Conversations with ISI. On an exciting note, James and I are turning this webinar series into a podcast, which will launch next Monday, February the 15th. So we'll have 3 episodes dropping on the 15th, including this one. And you can expect 2 podcast episodes from us every month. So thanks for tuning in to Conservative Conversations with ISI. And thanks for all of your generous support of ISI in many ways. Have a good night.
Thanks for listening to the interview. Be on the lookout for our upcoming episodes with Dr. Jeff Paulette of Hope College, an editor at Front Porch Republic, and the winner of the Conservative Book of the Year award, Yuval Levin.
Thanks again for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all the other information we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.